Hi, thank you. Welcome. And thank you for joining us today. I'm Stephanie Zeverino, Director of Business Development for Belmont Village, South Florida. We're so happy to have Dr. James Galvin on today to talk about a guide to a healthy brain and successful aging. He'll discuss strategies to improve brain health through physical activities, nutrition, mindfulness, and more. Dr. James Galvin will discuss the latest research on interventions that combine changes in lifestyle, reducing risk, health promotions, and management of multiple illnesses by using precision medicine. After Dr. Galvin's presentation, we'll open it up to Q&A, and we will get to as many questions as time will allow. So please be sure, as Anne mentioned earlier, to put your questions in the Q&A section on this webinar. Additionally, we invite you to stay on and learn about Belmont Village, and I'll introduce you to one of our family advisors, Susan Berger, to talk about our products and services. So let's get started. Dr. Galvin is currently a professor of neurology and psychiatry and behavioral science at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. He is founding director of the Comprehensive Center for Brain Health, director and principal investigator of the Lewy Body Dementia Research Center of Excellence, and chief of cognitive neurology for Palm Beach and Broward County's leading brain health and neurodegenerative disease research and clinical programs. He has authored numerous scientific publications on healthy brain, aging, cognitive health, Alzheimer's disease, Lewy body dementia, and related disorders. Welcome, Dr. Galvin.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I will share my screen. Hopefully that'll work. Usually it does. Okay. Can you see my screen?
We can.
Okay,
yes.
Perfect. All right. Well, welcome everybody. As Stephanie mentioned, my name is Dr. James Galvin. I'm a neurologist at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. And so I'm going to walk you through a lot of the research that we're doing in order to build a better brain as we get older. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge all the wonderful people I have the opportunity to work with, both in my lab at the University of Miami, as well as collaborators around the world. So, so before we get started, I think it's always good to talk about, so I'm talking about healthy brain aging. What exactly is a healthy brain as we age? Well, this is something that can occur well through the 10th decade of life. And from a cognitive perspective, a memory and thinking perspective, someone with a healthy brain can carry out all their activities independently with little assistance from others. Now, there may be some physical limitations like arthritis or a stroke, or some sensory limitations like vision loss or hearing loss that interfere with the abilities. But if we took away those physical limitations from a brain perspective, people would be able to do their activities. Some interesting things are, as we get older, our vocabulary and our knowledge of facts can continue to grow for our entire life. So one of the key things I want you to take away when we're talking about the rest of the talk is that there is actually no obvious memory loss that occurs solely as a function of aging. With aging, however, the speed of processing slows down, so everything takes longer. So it takes us longer to remember that person's name. It takes us longer to remember what we had for breakfast, but it comes back to us without the need of any assistance. If someone is having a memory problem, then that's not age. Something is causing it, and we need to find out that something. For the purpose of this talk, though, I'm going to really focus on what we can do to understand how we can healthy brain aging. So one of the things, of course, with healthy brain aging on the flip side is that people develop Alzheimer's disease or related disorders, and those are all dementias. So when we think about this in terms of what kind of programs and research we can do to study this, this is from a paper we published a couple of years ago. And so this is cognitive functioning, right? So cognitive function declines. This is age. And in the green area, so from birth to about the mid-40s to early 50s, people have no complaints typically, and they have no changes in their brain, pathology in their brain. From about 45 to 50 into the mid-60s, people may still have no symptoms, but now and some people, their brains may begin to show some changes of Alzheimer's disease. So this is what we call preclinical disease. And then from age 65 and on is when many people will develop cognitive symptoms. And so at the mild stages, it's called mild cognitive impairment, or MCI. And at the more significant stages, it's Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia. What's important is that we can start to think about how we can potentially prevent each of these stages from moving on. So if we want to attack someone sort of in the stages where they have no symptoms and no pathology, this is primary prevention. That is, prevent the onset of the disease before it ever occurs. If someone is starting to have some changes in their brain, but they have no symptoms, this is what we call secondary prevention. So what we want to do is reduce the impact of the disease and prevent the symptoms from appearing. And lastly, if people already have symptoms, this is what we call tertiary prevention. That is, we want to arrest the progression of an established disease and limit the disability. And so each of these strategies are possible, and they're all a little different. And so everybody is eligible for some form of a prevention strategy, but you have to tailor it to the individual and where they are in the course of their brain health. So we did a study a number of years ago where we looked at healthy people that we followed over a long period of time. It was a longitudinal study. And some people remained healthy controls. So that's this dark line here. And so we were following them for 10 or more years, and their memory really didn't change much over time. Well, there's a little bit of change that occurs with age, and that's mostly due to the slowed processing that we talked about. However, for people that we had followed who started out as healthy controls and then eventually developed Alzheimer's disease, right? So this dotted line here is where we diagnose them with Alzheimer's disease. We can see that about 2 years before their diagnosis, their memory testing started to change. And so what we call this area is this preclinical area. So they weren't diagnosed yet, but they were actually exhibiting change. And so from the red dotted line to birth, this would be that primary prevention stage. Between the red dotted line and the black dotted line, this would be that secondary prevention stage. And after the black dotted line, this would be that tertiary prevention stage. Again, so if we understand how people's brains are changing as they get older, we can develop strategies specific for that individual. And we've done a lot of data showing that we could really do this across all different diseases. So this applies to Alzheimer's disease and to Parkinson's disease and Lewy body dementia and mild cognitive impairment. It really doesn't matter. The principle is the same. There's a window of opportunity, right, where we can start to capture very, very early changes and potentially stop them or reverse them. And so this window of opportunity is really kind of unique. So this was a study we published in the past year. And so these people underwent special MRIs and special PET scans, nuclear medicine scans, that would allow us to image the amyloid protein that deposits in the brain of people who will eventually develop Alzheimer's disease. So in this graph, we have people who have no amyloid in their brain. At the far end, we have people who have amyloid in their brain. And in between, we have people who have just a little bit of amyloid, but not enough to say that it's a positive scan. When we looked at all of the different MRI measurements that we were doing, looking at the health of the brain, what we found was that as people move from amyloid negative to amyloid indeterminate or mild amyloid changes, this showed us signs of neuronal injury to the cells, and inflammatory changes. However, once they moved from this intermediate amyloid to being amyloid positive, what we saw were signs of neurodegeneration or cell death, okay? So again, very, very different windows of opportunity. Before there's anything, of course, this is our primary prevention. As people are depositing some changes in their brain, this allows us to do secondary prevention. And then once people have symptoms, this is tertiary prevention. So I sort of showed you 3 different ways that we think about this. One from purely a clinical sense, one from doing pencil and paper testing, and one from doing these detailed laboratory tests. And what we know from our research, there are several predictors that tell us whether someone is likely to go on to develop Alzheimer's disease. So when they may have some changes in their brain, but they don't have any symptoms yet. So first is that these people often have very early changes in decision-making and attention problems, right? And so this may be a very early clue. The second is something we call the absence of a practice effect. So if I were to give you a test and give you the same test every year, if you have a healthy brain, you'll remember that you got this test before, and if possible, you'll do better, right? So if you got a 94 on the exam, the next time you might get a 95 on the exam, the next time you might get a 96 on the exam, okay? So you improve a little bit. That's called a practice effect. What we found is that people who are healthy controls from a clinical perspective, they have no symptoms, but they have amyloid changes in their brain, they lose this practice effect. So they still score in the normal range, but they don't benefit from prior experience. It's a very early clue. We found other things. So people have mild depressive symptoms, if people have slowing in their movement, in their thinking, if there are changes in the way they walk, if there are changes in their physical performance, these may all be clues or future predictors of Alzheimer's disease. So I'm going to make you all scientists for a second. And so scientists like to build models. The advantage of building a model is we can try to help explain what's going on and then devise an intervention to attack it. So I'm a neurologist. I'm making you all neurologists for the moment. So we're all sitting in our office and someone comes into the office and they're complaining about their memory, and we do an exam and we decide that they have Alzheimer's disease. So that's this stage right here. But before they came into the office, they were having some symptoms, some cognitive change, okay? And that might be 2 or 3 years before they wind up getting diagnosed. Before they have the cognitive change, they're starting to have changes in their brain. Remember those windows I showed you? First, some signs of neuronal injury, and then neuronal death. And that might begin 5 to 7 years before people are diagnosed. Before there's neuronal injury, there's the deposition of the abnormal proteins, the amyloid and the tau proteins that make the plaques and tangles of Alzheimer's disease. And this might begin 20 years before clinical symptoms. Right? So now we're pushing this window farther and farther back, maybe to 20 years. And if you're going to deposit plaques and tangles, then there must be things that increase the risk of doing that. So let's call that risk factor A, okay? So risk factor A is important. We need to learn about risk factor A. But when we study the brains of people who have died who have Alzheimer's disease, they just don't have plaques and tangles. They have other pathologies, other changes. They have inflammatory changes. They have vascular changes, little mini strokes. So lots of other things are going on. Well, these aren't plaques and tangles, so they probably don't have the same risk factors. So let's call that risk factor B. So if we want to build a better brain, preserve our brain health, and reduce our risk or prevent dementia, then we can do this a couple of different ways. We can attack the risk factor A and reduce the plaques and the tangles. And this is what a lot of pharmaceutical companies are doing by developing medicines that can remove these proteins. So we're not going to talk any more about that today. Our approach has really been attacking all of these other things that are going on, okay? This gives us another pathway to choose to follow. And the reason for that is because when you look at the overall risk of developing a disease like Alzheimer's disease, we can break them into risk factors that increase the risk and protective factors that decrease the risk. And within the risk factors, there are things that are modifiable and not modifiable. So I can't modify your age, your sex, your family history, your genes. I can't change those things at all. But there are a whole host of things that increase the risk of developing diseases like Alzheimer's disease that we have some control over. So education, if it's on the low side, it's at a higher risk. Obesity increases the risk. Diabetes increases the risk. In fact, after age, diabetes may be the strongest risk factor for brain health problems and Alzheimer's disease, and a whole bunch of other things. There are also a bunch of protective factors. So things like staying socially engaged, physically active, cognitively active, eating a healthy diet, practicing mindfulness. All of these things protect our brain. They make our brain more resilient, okay? What's really important is that those modifiable factors, modifiable risk factors and modifiable protective factors explain up to 40% of the total risk of developing the disease, okay? So 60% of things we can't control, but 40% we can. And controlling that 40% might make all the difference of whether someone has a healthy brain as they get older or exhibits signs of disease. So this sets up this concept of what we call resilience versus vulnerability. What makes us resilient or resistant to disease, or what makes us vulnerable and develop the disease, okay? Now, we know a lot about genetics, and most diseases that we're talking about are not genetic, right? They occur randomly in the population. There are a few genes that do cause disease, and so we can study those genes to try to understand more about what happens to everybody else. And what we know is that there's genes and there's environment. And so a good gene can protect you from a bad environment, and a bad gene can be buffered by a good environment. Well, how about for everybody else where genes aren't really playing a big role? Well, that tells us that there is no single factor that can explain why some people develop Alzheimer's disease and some people don't. It's probably a very, very complex interaction between the things that make you more resilient, resistant to developing the disease, and the things that make you more vulnerable, more likely to develop the disease. And we're going to talk about that the rest of the way. When we think about this, we have to come up with strategies for how we might have a healthy brain as we get older and reduce our risk of developing diseases like Alzheimer's disease. And so we have 4 strategies that we apply in our programs. One is try to reduce risk, okay? So we try to understand the risk factors and reduce the frequency or severity of those risk factors that can lead to poor health. So for example, we know that smoking increases the risk for a whole lot of things. And so if you stop smoking, you can reduce your risk of developing smoking-related diseases, okay? That includes Alzheimer's disease. Health promotion, that's enabling or empowering people to have more control over their life, right? So if you don't exercise, we want you to start exercising. If you do exercise, we want you to continue exercising and increase the amount of exercise that you do. We can do something called healthful behavioral change. That is to change our habits to make the healthy choice, the easy choice, the right choice. So this might be altering the way we eat, choosing healthier foods, okay? And the last is really tightly controlling and managing other diseases or comorbid conditions, right? So the early detection and treatment of conditions that can contribute to brain health problems. So for example, recognizing the early signs of insulin resistance and prediabetes and diabetes, and then tightly managing it can reduce the consequences further down the road. So let me give you some examples. This is from a paper we published a couple of years ago. So if we look at smoking as a risk factor, smoking increased the risk of Alzheimer's disease by about 60%, 60. That means that about 4.7 million cases worldwide of Alzheimer's disease can be attributed to smoking. So if we were to reduce smoking by 25% in the population, we could prevent about 1 million cases of Alzheimer's disease. Same thing for diabetes, about a 40% risk factor. There's about 825 cases attributable to diabetes, and a 25% reduction can reduce by about 200,000 the number of cases. If you start to think about attacking all of these different risk factors, you can have a really significant effect on the risk of Alzheimer's disease. And this has nothing to do with plaques and tangles. This has to do with all of those other pathologies, those other modifiable risk factors. So we can start to think about how we can build a better brain, right? So, instead of following the yellow brick road, we're going to follow the little gray pathway here, right? And so from the time of our early life, each of the things accumulate. So less education, hearing loss, brain injury, hypertension, alcohol, obesity, smoking, depression, physical inactivity, diabetes, all of these things accumulate over the course of your life. That's about 40% of the risk, and that's potentially modifiable. Now, 60% of the risk is unknown. So let's not worry about the unknown. Let's focus on the known and things that we have control over. So how are people doing this? Well, there's a study going on. It's called the FINGER study. It's done in Finland. F is the Finnish part of the study. And so what they did was they took all of these risk factors and all of these protective factors, they studied them, and then they developed a little intervention, right? And so people either got regular health care or they got this really intense intervention, right? So everybody got nutritional counseling, everybody did exercise, everybody got cognitive training, everybody had their diseases managed, okay? And we're waiting to see how this study works. So the FINGER study is being done in Finland. Worldwide FINGER is being done throughout the European Union and Asia. The POINTER study, pointer being a finger, is being done in the US. But it's all the same study. Now, one of the challenge about this is that it's really an off-the-shelf kind of approach, right? So we look at the risk factors, but everybody's getting the same intervention. So again, remember, I made you all scientists before. So let's put back our science hat on for a second. And let's think about this. So you're sitting in your lab and you had this great idea for an intervention. And so before you do it in people, you may want to test it in some other system. So, you might want to test it in cells, or you might want to test it in little mice. And so we use special mice in the lab. They're called transgenic mice. So we basically control their genetic makeup. And you control everything about these mice and these cells now, how much food they get, how much light they get, how much exercise they get, how they grow. You control everything, right? And so you can give them either the placebo or the intervention that you're interested in. But again, this is, as a scientist, you know this all. Those cells are all clones of each other. Those mice are all clones of each other, okay? So now they're all exactly the same, and you control everything about them except you're giving one the intervention and one the placebo. So if you find a difference, then it has to be due to the intervention. And if you didn't find any difference, then that intervention didn't work, okay? But here's the problem, is that people are not cells, right? It's not the same thing. And so they're very, very different. They have different racial backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, genetic backgrounds. They have different diseases. They take different medicines for their diseases, right? They eat different foods. They have different social activities, physical activities, cognitive activity. So you're not controlling anything. So now you do the same experiment, right? Grabbing something off the shelf, intervention. You say, okay, one group's going to get the intervention, one group's not. Well, maybe there are differences, but there are some people that didn't respond. And you could say, well, the intervention didn't work, but there are some people that did benefit from it because they're all different, right? So our approach has really been to move away from sort of off-the-shelf kind of approach and think about what we call an N of one. It's a busy slide. Don't worry about the slide so much. There's a whole bunch of sort of different types of experiments that can be done. But what's important is we look at each individual as an individual, okay? And so the study becomes precision-based, based on a single individual. So each person is getting a personalized approach. So that leads us to some challenges. How do we measure these things? And how do we determine whether you've benefited, right? So is there a dose of activity that I need to give people? Like, how much exercise is enough exercise? How much reading is enough reading? These are real hard problems. Again, you're all scientists, at least for the next half hour. You're all scientists, and we're working on this together, trying to think this through as to how we're going to follow that path to a healthy brain. So we have to think about this. How are we going to measure how much education someone has, how much physical activity someone has, how much cognitive activity someone has? So we have to think about this. And so we've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And we've created tools that are really not available anywhere else. We're like the only lab that can do this, okay? This makes us very, very unique, right? So we created a system where people can give us information about how they're doing on their memory. It's called the Quick Dementia Rating System, okay? So it's 10 questions, they have multiple choice answers, takes 3 minutes to finish. And in fact, we can correctly classify people's cognitive abilities 88% of the time just by answering those 10 questions. Okay, think about it. That's pretty powerful, right? 10 questions can explain 88% of everything else we do. We can measure cognitive reserve. That is how strong your brain is to resist the effects of that pathology, right? So we created a scale to measure that. We can measure physical activity. We created this scale called the Quick Physical Activity Rating. So it's 10 different activities of different intensities, how often you do them, and how long do you do them. So we can measure intensity times frequency times duration, and we can come up with a dose, okay? So say you're a person who does very light activities, but you do it every day for several hours, right? So you walk, and you walk 2 hours a day. How do I compare that to someone who jogs twice a week? It's kind of hard. Now we can do it because we can figure out what's your dose of activity you're doing when we see you, and then how much we have to increase that dose to get an effect. We can do the same with cognitive activity. This is the Cognitive and Leisure Activity Scale. Same principle, a number of activities, how often you do them. It allows us to create a dose of cognitive activities, and then we can decide how we're going to change that. Why are we doing all these measurements? Because it tells us a lot about how healthy your brain is. So this is a cross-sectional analysis that is looking at people when they first come to see us. We haven't done anything to them yet, right? They're coming to see us for the very first time. The blue dots are healthy controls. The red dots are people with mild cognitive impairment, and the green dots are people with dementia. And when we look at their cognitive activities, the people with higher cognitive activities have better cognitive performance, and they have better, healthier brains, okay? So knowing this is really important because it helps us design the intervention specific for you. Remember, I said one of the earliest clues is difficulty solving problems. So we had to figure out how to test that so we can test it across everybody. So we created this sort of coding test, right? And so there's numbers and symbols, and you have to code back and forth. It's a very strong predictor of how strong your brain is in terms of its performance. We can measure diet. How do I measure diet? How do I determine, what Mrs. Jones eats compared to Mrs. Smith eats? It's very hard to do that. So we created a scale that we could actually capture data and measure units of something called the MIND diet. This is a brain healthy diet. And we found that the performance on cognitive testing is very closely related to the kind of diet people eat. What about mindfulness? Mindfulness is living in the moment, not letting the weight of the world bear down upon you, right? And so we can measure this, and we've demonstrated that people who have higher levels of mindfulness have less subjective complaints, less depression, better cognitive performance, and a bigger brain, okay? So again, we can measure all these things that are really important. We can also measure the vulnerability. So for example, vascular disease. We created a brief scale that we can actually quantify people's vascular burden without having to do an MRI, and how that can predict how someone's going to do on their cognitive testing and their risk of dementia. So we designed all of this into a study. And so we enrolled people into the study with no cognitive impairment. This was our primary prevention. People with the very, very mildest symptoms, that was the secondary prevention. And people with dementia, that was tertiary prevention. We collected lots and lots and lots of data. We gave them a personalized prevention plan. And we wanted to see if they could do it on their own. So what would happen if we just gave people this plan that's tailored to them? What would happen? Here's what happened to the first 104 people. So in the orange are those primary prevention, people with no dementia. In the blue are the people with mild cognitive impairment or secondary prevention. And the people in the green were the people who had dementia and tertiary prevention. And what we found is that in the primary prevention, 80% of people actually got better. So as we tested their cognitive performance, they were improving over time. For the secondary prevention, 63% improved over time, okay? But in the tertiary prevention, only about 20% improved. So if you already had dementia, this approach wasn't quite as effective as we would have liked to improve cognition. So for primary and secondary prevention, overall, about 70% of people showed improvement, okay? And the tertiary prevention wasn't quite as effective. But we were able to do other things. Remember, it's a big program. We're managing medical conditions. We're looking for risk factors. We're doing behavioral change. And so, in fact, we were able to improve people's health in other ways. So, for example, for almost everybody, we reduced any signs of depression. We were able to reduce inflammation. So homocysteine is a blood marker that we can measure. And it's a risk factor for heart disease, strokes, and Alzheimer's disease. And we were basically able to normalize this in everybody. Okay, so using this multimodal approach, looking at each person as an individual and designing a program for you. We were also able to reduce stroke risk. So for the people who had low stroke risk, we kept them low risk. And for the people who had high risk, in most individuals, we were able to reduce their risk. The one thing we found when we gave them to do the plan on their own, if they followed the plan, they had good outcomes. And if they didn't follow the plan, well, guess what? They didn't have good outcomes. You don't need to be a scientist to figure that one out. The other thing we're trying to do is figure out new and novel ways of picking up people's risk factors, right? And this is very important, right? Because while research projects can do this $1 million workup. In real world, we can't do that. It's just not practical, right? So we're trying to come up with different ways that we can do this. One way we've done this with something called optical coherence tomography. Excuse me. So if anybody, for example, has gone to the eye doctor to look for signs of macular degeneration or glaucoma, this is a machine the doctor might have used. So it looks at the retina. What's interesting, excuse me, is that the retina is actually the same tissue as your brain. So what's ever happening in your brain may also be seen in the retina. So we use the machine not to look for a macular degeneration, but try to understand the health of the retina. And does this reflect the health of the brain? So this is a picture right here, and we can actually measure the thickness of the retina. And what we found is as the retina thins out, people have worse cognitive performance. And that the retinal thickness is related to the size of the brain. So we have this very easy marker, takes 10 seconds to do OCT, and so we can do it in a large number of people very quickly. Another thing we're interested in looking how people walk. Remember I said changes in walking may be an early sign of Alzheimer's disease. So we did this study, we had people walk back and forth and we gave them things to do while they were walking. So we had them walk by themselves, then we had them walk saying the alphabet, and then we had them walk by doing math, doing serial subtraction. So 100 minus 7 is 93, minus 7, so all the way down. And what we found was that using just the gait, and then we plugged it all into a computer. So we had this computer do some artificial intelligence. And the computer was able to pick out the healthy controls versus the MCIs or the Alzheimer's disease based solely on how people are walking. No other information. Didn't have their age, didn't have their cognitive test, didn't know their sex, didn't know whether they smoked. All it looked at is how they walked. Very, very powerful, simple way of potentially identifying people very early on with the problem. The other thing we're doing is working with companies to develop blood tests, because ultimately a blood test is going to be the way we'd like to do it. So we have people who are healthy controls and people who have mild impairment, and some healthy controls actually have changes in their brain that we can measure in their blood, okay? So this may represent that preclinical group. This would be the ideal group to do that secondary prevention. So I've talked about our ability to measure physical activity and cognitive activity and social engagement and diet and mindfulness. Well, if all of these things protect our brain, what if we put them all together to really understand the resilience of the brain? And so that's what we did. So we created this resilience score. So in about 7 minutes, completing a bunch of questions, we can understand the resilience of your brain, okay? And what's really interesting, let's go back to those blood tests. So we have the group that has preclinical Alzheimer's disease, or healthy controls with abnormal blood tests, and people with mild cognitive impairment that's due to Alzheimer's disease. So they have symptoms in abnormal blood test. When we look at the blood test, there's no difference between the groups. They have the same amount of abnormalities, but one group has symptoms and one group doesn't. Why is that? Well, it's because their resilience score is different. So the people who have no symptoms, their brains are more resilient. Okay. That suggests that we potentially can build a better brain as we get older to resist the effects of aging and Alzheimer's disease. Now, what's the flip side of that is vulnerability. So resilience, what makes us resist getting disease, vulnerability, which increases our risk of disease. We now created a way that we can measure this. So here's our vulnerability scale, right? It includes both modifiable and non-modifiable factors, right? And so now we can measure people's vulnerability. And what's really interesting is if we look at either vulnerability or resilience, we can look at either one separately right now. People who have low vulnerability have healthier brains. People who have high vulnerability have less healthy brains, and they perform worse on every single measure that we take. All that data we collect, they perform worse. We look at resilience. People who have high resilience have healthier brains than people who have low resilience. The people who have high resilience perform better on every test that we do, regardless of the type of test. If we combine resilience and vulnerability together, now we're starting to see people separate. So the people who have high vulnerability and low resilience are people who are likely to have Alzheimer's disease, and people who have high resilience and low vulnerability are likely to be healthy controls. Okay. So now in about 8 minutes, we're able to separate people further. Remember, I said one of the earliest risk factors is this change in executive function, decision-making, problem-solving, attention. We created a test to look at that. Now we add that test in there. And what we do is now the people are separating out into different clusters, okay? So we have a measure of brain health, resilience, of brain disease, vulnerability, and brain performance, that number symbol test. And we now can see distinct groupings of people based on 9 minutes of testing. So in less than 10 minutes, we're able to completely characterize how healthy your brain is and the design and intervention to address those problems. So this allows us now to think about redesigning the intervention, because we did it once and we kind of learned a lot from it. Tertiary prevention doesn't work as well in this framework for cognition, although other benefits are seen. So we have to think about other ways of taking care of people who already have symptomatic disease. Adherence is the key. If you don't follow the plan, it doesn't work. We have to think about resilience and vulnerability effects. So we want to redo this now and see if under specific medical direction, we can improve the outcomes. The other thing we're doing is more artificial intelligence, machine learning. So we're taking all of this information. So all the data from our studies, looking at MRIs and PET scans and blood tests and genetics, and kind of feeding into the computer and see if we can come up with a better model that helps us understand and make predictions. And here's just an example. So this is a paper that we just submitted to a journal. And so we took data from a large national study, and we took all of their clinical data, their imaging data, and their genetic data, and we fed it into the machine. And what we're able to create are very, very different profiles. So these are all the different profiles we created. But here's the important part. We're now able, from just this machine learning profile, to look at people who are healthy controls, who are going to stay healthy, people who are healthy controls who are progressing to MCI or Alzheimer's disease. We can look at people who are MCI who are going to stay stable, and MCI who's going to progress to Alzheimer's disease. We can look at Alzheimer's disease that's going to progress slowly, or Alzheimer's disease that's going to progress more rapidly. So we're able to use all this artificial intelligence to create these profiles. So we could look at people at the very first time we see them and make predictions of what's going to happen, and then design an intervention to try to prevent that. So let me give you an example in a real world setting. So this was an individual who came to see us. She was in her 50s. She has some thyroid disease. Her mother and grandmother developed dementia, different dementias, but developed a dementia. She reports no changes, family reports no changes, but she wants to do everything she can to reduce her risk. So she went through this big, long assessment that we do, collecting all of this information. We kind of looked at it all, and we found that overall, she was normal. But we found a bunch of little clues that told us that there was things to work on. So for example, she had some mild difficulty in working memory, which is one of those problem-solving skills, an early risk factor, right? She had a mild blockage in her carotid artery, not enough that the surgeons were going to do anything about it, but why wait for it to get worse before you try to do something about it? So what we're able to find are a bunch of cognitive risk factors, vascular risk factors, metabolic risk factors, and a bunch of these other proxy markers that tell us something's happening. And then we're able to design a personalized prevention plan for her, right? And so don't worry about the individual steps here, but the idea is that we were able to look for her risk factors, identify them, and then develop an intervention. And then we can see how she does as we follow her going forward. So basically, this allows us then to build a guide to brain health. We can use all of this information to create a personalized risk profile. That allows us then to create a personalized prevention plan, track how you're doing and making all sorts of adjustments. And it really provides something for everyone at every stage of the process. So we make our little checklist here, right? And we check off things as we go by, and then we can figure out, are people benefiting from what we're doing? So for example, if you came to see us and we decided you had healthy cognitive aging, then we would aggressively diagnose and treat all comorbid diseases. If you had high blood pressure or diabetes or cholesterol abnormalities, we want to tightly get these under control. We want to do a deep reevaluation of all of your lifestyle choices. Look at your social activities, your physical activities, your cognitive activities, get you started following the principles of the MIND diet. If you're a smoker, stop smoking, reduce your alcohol intake. You don't have to stop it, but we want to reduce it, and we want to follow that MIND guideline, which has alcohol included as one of the components of a healthy diet. We want to begin mindfulness-based activities, right? We want to think about things like meditation, yoga, tai chi, other types of activities that are mindfulness-based, right? Consider rolling in a research project. And if you can afford it, think about long-term care insurance, right? Because this is the time to do it when your brain is healthy so that you have protection for the future. What about if you come to us with mild cognitive impairment? Well, now we're going to shift because we're moving into that secondary prevention, right? So we want to reduce the risk factors to the best of our ability because some things have already happened, right? We want to look aggressively for underlying causes. We want to do advanced care planning, durable power of attorney, right? We want to prepare for the future, right? We want to reevaluate all of those lifestyle choices. We want to think about whether we want to begin medications, right? Even if medications aren't approved for this stage yet, we want to have that discussion. Is it worth starting a medication? We want to do health coaching and counseling. We want to make arrangements for future driving. I'm not saying that people can't drive now, but we want to have that discussion now so we can plan for the future, right? And again, participate in research programs. What about the mild to moderate stages of Alzheimer's disease or other dementias? Well, now we want to make sure you're on therapy. We want to maximize the secondary risk reduction. So we want to reduce the risk of strokes or heart disease that could significantly affect your brain health, right? If not already done, we want to make sure that advanced care planning is completed, okay? Maybe we want to do a driving evaluation at this point, right? Because about 50% of people at the mild stage are starting to have problems with their driving, even if they're not aware, okay? We want to look at the ability to increase socialization and cognitive stimulation. We have to find out what matters to the patient in order to improve their quality of life. So again, we can personalize it and tailor it to their individual needs, okay? And again, research participation support groups. Now, even at the moderate to severe stages, we can think about increasing our medication approaches, treating other symptoms. We want to look for falls because that can significantly change someone's quality of life and health outcomes, right? We want to think about whether a home health aide is needed. We want to think about end-of-life decisions. Even if we don't, not at the end of life, the time to think about end-of-life decisions is before you need to activate those things. And again, are there research opportunities? Again, so that there's always a plan for everybody, but it's different for different people because different people have different needs and you need to personalize it to them. So to summarize what I was saying, there may be multiple pathways to diseases like Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. So there may be multiple pathways to having a healthy brain to diagnose, treat, prevent, or cure disease. Prevention efforts, building that better brain, is more successful when it's multimodal, looking at-risk individuals based on their individual risk profile and guided by our research, our biomarkers. There are different strategies are needed for people in different stages of disease. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, okay? We really want to focus on making you the best you can be. And that best you is going to be different than the person next to you's best you, right? And so our approaches really have been trying to personalize this to the greatest extent, really using precision medicine-based approaches. Or to quote a famous American, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It was Benjamin Franklin in 1735. Now, to be fair, he was talking about firehouses, but I think it's also relevant for brain health. So I want to thank you all for spending some time with me, listening to me talking about brain health. I also want to thank all of the wonderful people I get to work with. If you're interested in finding more information, here's our email, healthybrain@miami.edu. Feel free to email us and somebody will get back to you. I'm happy to take any questions that popped up over the course of the talk. Thank you for your attention.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Galvin. I think what I got out of this is there is hope. And I think that's the most important thing that everyone needs to know, that there are things that can be done to stay ahead of it. And we do have quite a few questions. I'd like to like to see if we can get to some of them. First one I'm going to ask you, Dr. Galvin, is one that was emailed to me a couple of days ago. So this is a woman who is asking, actually stating that her husband was diagnosed 2 years ago with either Lewy body or PSP. Doctor wasn't positive. Patient showed understanding of good movies, political, historical discussions by focusing on them. No communication though whatsoever. No response to anything, even pain. Left side like paralyzed, hand, leg, no meds. We do exercise. My question is, does he understand anything at all? Any way of knowing? No answers from his doctor.
Right. So I will preface my answer with a statement, and that is, having not examined a person, I cannot give specific answers to anybody's specific personal medical questions. I can give you a general answer that's broad, but conservative, because again, I've not seen the person. So Lewy body dementia is a common cause of dementia after Alzheimer's disease. It has a lot of mixed symptoms, hallucinations, some Parkinson-like features, sleep disturbances. Progressive supranuclear palsy, or PSP, is a very rare disorder that looks a little like Parkinson's, but is very focal. So it often has one side of the body that's very, very affected, much more than the other side. So Robin Williams had Lewy body dementia. Dudley Moore had progressive supranuclear palsy, right? Those are famous people that had these diseases. The diseases are very different. They can be challenging in the beginning to differentiate between. There are some ways to do it, but largely it's a clinical evaluation. If someone is not very communicative, it often is difficult to know how much they're understanding. So it is always a challenge. I like to make the assumption that people understand more than they can express. So I always try to be mindful of that when I try to include them in conversations and see if they're paying attention. If they're paying attention, they may be understanding at least some of it. But it is difficult sometimes in someone who can't communicate to fully understand whether they understand and comprehend what's going on.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see, will Dr. Galvin comment on traumatic brain injury, TBI, and the impact on brain function beyond expected age-related changes?
So the TBI, or traumatic brain injury, is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, but it also is a risk factor for something called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, which is a different form of neurodegenerative diseases. So many of the football players, for example, who have had repetitive concussions and have gone on to have behavioral changes, and some have died and had autopsies, they have what's called CTE. Some boxers have also had things called CTE. So traumatic brain injury is a risk factor. It sort of, one way to think about it is that repetitive injuries sort of accelerate the brain aging process. So a person who's 40 or 50 who's had repetitive brain injuries, their brain's age may look closer to someone in the 70s or 80s. So that may be why they develop symptoms much earlier than typically we see with most of these diseases, which occur in the 70s and 80s. So it may accelerate brain aging. On top of that, depending on where the injury is, if it's significant enough, it can affect that part of the brain's function. So if it's in the motor area, it can affect motor function. If it's in the visual area, it can affect visual function. So it depends on where the injury is as well.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, normal age-related hearing loss versus what level for a risk factor? I'm not sure I understand that question, but hopefully you do.
So we're beginning to understand that hearing loss is a risk factor for dementia. What we don't understand exactly is what threshold of hearing loss, because there is some age-related hearing loss that occurs, particularly for, unfortunately, the range of human voice. So people find that they hear like loud noises really well, but they may not hear what people are saying very well. And so there's a lot of research to try to go on to try to understand that. That's some of the things that we're looking at as well. But there is no clear threshold as to how much hearing loss is a risk factor. but people who are hard of hearing seem to have a higher risk factor than people whose hearing is preserved. We don't have a threshold yet.
Okay. Let's see. My husband is a Belmont Village resident and is currently in our Circle of Friends program. That's for mild cognitive impairment. He has a severe bilateral hearing loss. He refuses to wear his hearing aids, wore when first received, and it helped him a lot. Also, he does not make good nutritional decisions, does not follow Mind Diet, plus his sleep is disrupted. Any advice?
Yeah, well, again, I can't give you specifics, but I'll try to give you some general pointers that we do. So getting people to wear hearing aids is really challenging. It is. My dad, who's not cognitively impaired, doesn't want to wear his hearing aid either. So it is always a challenge. You know, I think you have to pick your battles and decide when someone needs to wear them and not need to wear them, and see if you can coax that person into wearing them at least sometimes, particularly times that's most important. But it clearly is a challenge. If he wears them, he'll be able to hear. If you hear, you can attend. If you can attend, you can remember. If you don't hear, there's no way you're going to remember, right? So it's a battle. In terms of nutritional decisions, also a battle. But I think the idea of following something like the Mind diet is it's not really a diet, it's a nutritional lifestyle, right? And so it allows you to have a piece of cake. You just limit the amount of servings you have per week, right? It allows you to have some unhealthy food, but it tries to balance that out with having more healthy foods. So it's really sort of a menu of options, right? And so the idea is, how many servings do you get of the healthy foods? And is that enough to raise your score, right? So like there's a little wine allowed, there's some sweets allowed, but we try to push fresh fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lean meats, but there's also things that are not healthy on there. And the idea is to try to reduce the number of servings that you get on that. So it's really thinking about lifestyle. A health coach might be an option, or consultation with a nutritionist or a dietitian might also be. Because if people don't like broccoli, it's hard to get them to eat broccoli. But if you can find something that's in the broccoli family they like, that might work.
Yeah, I still can't eat tomatoes. I just can't do it. I tried, but I can't. Some Italian I am. Okay, let's see. How do we get someone to be evaluated by your organization? And I was going to ask that question too, because you are in Miami and we've got a national audience today. And so number one, what do you say about that, Dr. Galvin?
Well, so the best way to get in touch with us is our email. It's healthybrain, one word, healthybrain @miami.edu. And so that's our email, and we say it goes to someone so that we answer all of our emails. We can give you information about how you could participate in one of our many, many, many projects. We're actually located in Boca Raton, which is about 55 miles north of Miami. So we're not in the city of Miami. I'm part of the University of Miami, but I'm in the northern reaches of their territory. But if you email us, we're happy to try to answer questions, refer you to somebody. We have support groups, we have psychosocial groups, we have counseling, we have nutritional programs, we have research programs, we have a lot of different programs, and we're happy to try to get you that information.
And I've been there, I visited you there. It's a wonderful, wonderful facility. All right, let's see if we can get to a few more questions. Diagnosed with PD in December 2020 and assume I have mild to moderate dementia. I tried to get long-term care insurance in February of 21 and was told I was turned down. Is it possible to get insurance at this stage?
Right. Well, I'm not an insurance agent. So again, I'm going to talk in generalities. In general, insurance companies want to insure healthy people and not unhealthy people. That's how they make their money. So long-term care insurance is basically a bet by the insurance company that you will remain healthy until you die and not need long-term care. So if you already have a medical issue that is linked to long-term care, it is less likely that they will insure you. So I think one of the challenges is, and again, I can't answer this question for all companies, but if you have a chronic disease it's much harder to get long-term care insurance than if you don't have a chronic disease. That's why it's so important to have this conversation really, really early so that you can buy that protection, because once you have the protection, they can't take it away from you as long as you pay your premiums. But once you have a disease, then it's much harder to get insured.
All right, let's see. We've got about 3 more minutes. Thank you, Dr. Galvin. Is slow to progress Alzheimer's disease a sign of resilience in the patient's brain?
That is a great question. What I would say is that what we understand from our research so far is that the battle between resilience and vulnerability is that vulnerability tends to win out a little bit. So the more resilience you have, the more you can stave off the effects of disease. So if we were to look at 2 people with Alzheimer's disease and one is progressing more rapidly than another, we'd want to look at a combination of the vulnerability factors. So does that more rapid progressor have uncontrolled diabetes or high blood pressure? Are they a smoker? All those things that make them more vulnerable. Versus the person who's moving slower, do they have more resilience? So that's why we have to take a very personalized approach to each individual and look at the balance of those resilience and vulnerability factors.
Right. Yeah, everyone is different. Let's see, it appears that the preventative measures of a specific healthy diet, increased exercise, social interaction, and mindfulness are critical for everyone's body and mind to avoid a multitude of disease. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if you think about what your doctor has told you probably your whole life in various ways, shapes, and forms, basically what I'm telling you is to stay mentally active, physically fit, socially engaged, and eat a heart-healthy diet, right? Those things are not only good for your heart, they're good for your brain. And so what I tried to share with you today is how to go down the yellow brick road of brain health, right? And if you ever go back and watch The Wizard of Oz again, pay attention to when Dorothy starts her journey. Because next to the yellow brick road is a red brick road, and the red brick road is a dead end. So the idea is, how can I get you on the right path to brain health? And that's what the point of our talk was today.
Wonderful. All right, I think we've got maybe 1 or 2 more questions. We're kind of running out of time here. This is a good one. I am African American. Question, does the finger study include African Americans? And 2, if you have diabetes in your history and traumatic brain injury in your history, should you lay off chemical hair products, which I have heard may be a factor to brain function and may have a risk for dementia? Have you heard of the research on hair products?
Right. So the finger study is done in Finland. Obviously, there are relatively few African Americans in Finland. The pointer study, which is done in the US, is meant to be multicultural. And so the goal is to try to have representative samples of African Americans, Asian Americans, and Hispanics. I think they're still recruiting, so I don't know what the population looks like, but the goal is at least to try to be inclusive. Our studies, we try to be inclusive. The second part of your question is, so diabetes is a risk factor, so you want to make sure you control your diabetes. Traumatic brain injury is a risk factor, so you want to make sure you protect your head where possible, and discuss with your physician if you're noticing any changes. The thing about chemical products and exposures is that it's a minefield of a question to try to answer. So because the exposures are always really challenging to fully understand. I think that most hair products and most cosmetic products remain external, and so they may not be good for your hair or they may not be good for your skin, but it's unclear that they're not good for your brain. However, some products, so for example, there was an article yesterday in the news on PBS about people using skin whiteners. So around the world, there are all these skin whitening products that are being used, and many of them contain mercury in order to help whiten the skin. And mercury is dangerous for you. It's a toxin, right? And so these products are often pushed to non-white populations to try to lighten their skin. And so they contain a lot of bad chemicals. So I think you should always look at the back of the bottle and see, what's in there and do the research as to whether that makes sense. For an African-American woman who may be using a hair product, think about whether you want to continue using the hair product to straighten your hair, or whether you want to have natural hair, whether you want to do sister locks or some other way of doing your hair. I mean, these are all personal decisions. I can't make those decisions for you, but I think always turn over the label and look what's there and do your research and see, is there any link to those ingredients with some problems? And many times there are.
Labels are always a telltale sign of what you're putting in yourself, in your body, on your hair.
If you can't say what's on the label, it's probably not good.
Yeah, exactly. You can't pronounce half of it. All right, final question. So does it make sense to have your doctor during your annual physical do a cognitive test on you? And at what age should you start?
So the annual wellness visit, which is part of the Welcome to Medicare package, right, actually has in its requirements a mandate for the doctor to address cognition, but there's no specifics as to how that could be addressed. In my opinion, people over the age of 60 should probably, as part of their physical, have their memory checked, just like they get their blood pressure checked. So you really should think about memory check as being like the fifth vital sign, right? So we check your height, your weight, your blood pressure, your pulse, your temperature. We should check your memory as well. Because the idea is the sooner we can identify these things, the more we can do. We can always do something, always do something. It's never too late, but it's never too early.
All right, Dr. Galvin, thank you so much. I think we're going to wrap it up here. We're out of time, but I appreciate your time and your information. And it was obviously well received. We had a few more questions come in, but we unfortunately we're out of time. So thank you so much for today. We really appreciate it, Dr. Galvin.
Well, thank you so much. All of you have a great day, and I wish you well. Stay safe, stay healthy.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, everyone. Now I'd like to introduce you to Susan Berger, who's going to talk about Belmont Village. Hi, Susan. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you, Stephanie. Wow. Listening to Dr. Galvin, it is so apparent that at Belmont Village, we are doing it right. For 24 years, we have owned and operated best-in-class, fully licensed senior living communities. And we're founded on the belief that seniors deserve to live self-directed lives in a supportive community, filled with new friendships and interests, safety and security, quality and value, and a place that they can call home. It is all about quality of life at Belmont. It's all about health, energy, and purpose. We want all of our residents to stay healthy and active, and in so doing, to live well. We do know that what you eat and drink, how much you exercise, and the way you socialize are all equally important to successful aging. And we believe in a person-centered approach in providing our services. As our residents receive help with activities of daily living, they receive them when needed. Although their needs may vary, they can count on our caring and compassionate staff who are committed to providing high-quality, person-centered care. Residents can also count on our Belmont Village nurses. Those are trained medical professionals who are dedicated to serve the healthcare needs of each resident. Our nurses are keen observers and can quickly assess changes in residents' health. And most importantly, they're there on site 24 hours a day to provide peace of mind for not only the resident, but for their families as well. And also, we know that successful aging involves staying active. Whether our residents want to kickstart their day with group fitness or one-on-one exercise, our goal is to help stimulate both their minds and body, but at whatever level they feel successful. And what better way to stay physically engaged than under the watchful eyes of our team of licensed physical therapists on site with a state-of-the-art gym fully equipped with senior-friendly equipment. and to specifically address the needs and abilities of residents with mild cognitive impairment and early stage memory loss, Belmont Village has pioneered a comprehensive therapeutic program that Stephanie referred to as the Circle of Friends. This is a whole brain fitness lifestyle, one that combines our highly regarded wellness model with mental fitness, and it has proven to have a profound impact on addressing the needs and abilities of residents with early stage memory loss. We believe in what we call the Just Right Challenge every day to encourage residents to stay involved, to build their confidence, and to have happy, fulfilling days. The Circle of Friends is changing how providers and families now think about assisted living and memory care. Memory loss doesn't always have to happen behind a closed door. In Belmont Village communities across the United States and Mexico, we strive to create a positive experience for all of our members, including our residents, their families, and our employees. And year after year, we continue to set new standards in resident and family satisfaction. We've also been recognized as a great place to work and named to Fortune magazine's top 50 best workplaces for aging services by our 4,000 employees nationwide. As we all know, happy, dedicated employees make for happy residents and happy families. Choosing a senior living community is one of the most important life decisions. Please take the time to compare. Do not wait for a crisis to react. If you have any questions about Belmont Village or our Circle of Friends program, I do hope that you will give me a call or send me a text or email. My phone number is 424-232-0701. And my email is sberger@belmontvillage.com. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I look forward to seeing you at our next event. Stephanie, back to you.
Oh, great, Susan. Thank you so much. Everyone, we thank you for staying on and for listening to our webinar, and we will see you next time. Stay safe, stay healthy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.